So thank you very much to the organizers. I'm very honored, humbled to be here. Really appreciate it. Today I'm going to talk about the idea that we classify aging as something I termed meta-disease. What do I mean by that? Try to explain why I sort of came up with this term. There's a lot of debate in the community. There has been a lot of debate in the community recently about whether aging should be classified as a disease or not a disease. And this debate is ongoing. What is a disease exactly? So if you look up the definition of a disease in various dictionaries, you'll see, for example, the condition of the living animal that impairs normal functioning, and it's manifested by distinguishing signs and symptoms. Or, for example, in the Oxford English, a disorder of structure or function in a human, animal, or plant, especially one that produces specific symptoms or that affects a specific location. So if we look at that, we might say, well, aging kind of is a disease by that definition. So maybe we should classify it as a disease. On the other hand, why am I saying meta? So I'll go back to disease versus not disease. Meta usually means something comprehensive or transcending the usual definition of a term. So you can apply it to one discipline. So for example, physics, you can apply the term meta to arrive at metaphysics, which is more of a philosophical foundation to physics. In terms of actual disease, the term meta-disease has actually been used before by Abraham Maslow. So he used the term meta-disease to depict the origins of physical disease of having a psychological or emotional basis. So I don't actually believe that, but he was kind of thinking along the lines, are there foundations to disease that precede what we call diseases or common age-related diseases? Likewise, thoughts and feelings, if you thought about your own thoughts or about someone else's thought, that would be metacognition. So you're kind of thinking about your own thinking. However, when we talk about disease, we usually primarily talking about phenomena we observe at the macroscopic level. So cancer, heart disease, and so on. Diabetes. So it's something that we observe that's macroscopic. But the causes for those diseases occur at the microscopic level. So for example, we take cancer as an example. Cancer is caused usually by mutations in various genes, P53, RB, and so on. So there's very many genes that are implicated in cancer. If you mutate one of those genes or several of those genes, you will eventually end up with a cancer. A P53 mutation, though, is not cancer. So it's something that's occurring in the DNA at the microscopic level, but then causes ultimately cancer. So the mutation is the cause, the disease is the effect. But we use the term aging kind of nebulously in that we refer to it as the cause. So we sometimes talk about damage to DNA as aging or damage to cells as aging. But these are really causes that lead to the macroscopic effect that we call aging. And we kind of mix up those terms. And we talk about cellular aging, aging of the heart and so on. So we're kind of blurring the line because aging is actually stratified onto multiple levels. And we really start out at the bottom with the molecular damage, which Aubrey was talking about earlier. And this is really the foundation. This is the causal level of aging, is down at the molecular level. And then we move up to the macroscopic and we see these seemingly independent age-related diseases, heart disease and so on, as the manifestation of those causes. That is the macroscopic manifestation. But really it's a continuum. It's a continuum of stratified levels from cause to effect. And we use aging to kind of refer to all of these. So because it's a multi-layer phenomenon, because we refer to aging both as cause and effect, and because all of those age-related diseases are kind of within the set of aging, we can therefore conclude that aging is the meta-disease, not a meta-disease or something, but it's actually the meta-disease that leads to the consequences of all of these age-related diseases. So there's certain techniques in cellular biology in which we can reprogram cells, so we can take a cell from someone with heart disease, for example, and reprogram it to an earlier state. We can reverse a lot of these changes. And I'll go back to that later. So aging can be viewed as both a disease and not a disease, hence the term metadisease. Why create such a term? Do we even need it? Sometimes creating a new word aids our thinking by allowing us to perceive something in a slightly different way than before. So our understanding of reality or any phenomenon is really determined to some degree by the refinement that we apply to our vocabulary and the definitions that we use to define reality. So as an example, a very basic example, the number of words that we use to describe different colors appears to affect our color perception. There's quite a bit of evidence that, several centuries ago, maybe a couple of thousand years ago, humans couldn't actually see the color blue. And I don't mean that, I take that back. It's not that we couldn't see blue, we couldn't perceive blue accurately. If you go back and look at literature, it's described as a grayish kind of hue and so on and so forth. And even today, there are some populations that don't have a word for blue. The Himba tribe, for example, they don't have a word for blue. They have many words for green, though, and this has been tested experimentally. They have a hard time distinguishing between blue and green if you show them a series of colors on a screen. But they have a remarkable number of words for green. Maybe a dozen different words for different hues of green. And if you show them this image, they can very, very quickly identify which of those green squares is different to all the others. And I got to admit, it took me a long time. It's actually the one around 1 o'clock. Is a slightly different shade of green than all the others. So their perception has actually been altered by their vocabulary, by their definitions that they apply to reality. So I think that thinking about aging as a meta-disease kind of gives us a slightly different perspective, perhaps a little bit more insight into exactly what we're dealing with. Now, I want to segue a little bit into my own personal journey regarding understanding aging. So I started studying aging from the perspective of progeria, which is an accelerated aging disease. And there's very, very many manifestations at the macroscopic level, as I said, that you see in progeria that you see in normal aging. Atherosclerosis, heart disease, hip muscular atrophy, sarcopenia, and so on. So it really looks like aging, but when we started out studying this disease, there was really another debate going on as to whether it really represents aging, or does it represent something that kind of strangely looks like aging but doesn't really have anything to do with normal aging. I think it actually is aging, and I'll explain why. So this is a mother and child with progeria. You can see that the child, in many ways, looks older than his mother. At the cellular level, aging is caused by a mutation in a gene called lamin A, which distorts the nucleus of a cell. It leads to damaged DNA, disruption of the endoplasmic reticulum, alteration of cell cycle, and so on. So it really kind of messes up the internal workings of a cell on many, many different levels, in many, many different ways. Also, when we look at the gene expression in progeria cells, compared to different ages of normal aging humans, we find that the gene expression in progeria cells looks remarkably like middle-aged and old humans. It doesn't look like a young person at all. And if you cluster the gene expression, the principal components of the gene expression analysis, you will find that, again, progeria resembles old age at the gene expression level much more than young cells. And likewise, in various ways that one can study the cells, they appear to be old. So what are some of these differences I'm talking about? In normal aging on the left, we have telomere loss, we have DNA double-strand breaks, epigenetic changes, stem cell depletion, and cellular senescence. We see exactly all of these things we see also in progeria. But the main difference is that in progeria, we have this lamin A mutation, which appears to be accelerating everything. Note that Microscopically, we can see, if you really look at these individuals, one extreme old age, one with progeria, you may notice that there's actually macroscopically an extreme depletion of cells there. So look at the child with progeria, loss of hair follicles, loss of subcutaneous fat, loss of muscle. So the cells are literally visible. We can almost visibly see, we can almost see a bridge there between the macroscopic and the microscopic and the cellular senescence. We can almost visually see that they are severely depleted of cells. And this also manifests in the blood vessels. It leads to heart disease and so on. This is also happening in the person with extreme old age. What is the connection between the two? And I'm going to come back to that. I believe that the ultimate connection between the microscopic causes and the macroscopic effects is something called, some of you will know already, cellular senescence. So I believe that this is the bridge. This is what I call the causal nexus. So you can have many different causes. Remember I was saying epigenetics, loss of telomeres, mitochondrial damage, and so on. How does that lead to what we see, what we visibly see as old age and all these age-related diseases? I believe it's cellular senescence. It's the loss of the capacity of cells to divide, which leads to a depletion of cells and various other types of consequences in the body. There's actually theoretical support for this, which goes back centuries, actually, to August Weismann, who believed that death takes place because a worn-out tissue cannot forever renew itself, and a capacity for increase by means of cell division is not everlasting but finite. So he realized that life itself, the germline, has been perpetuated on Earth for billions of years. So all the way through evolution, life has been going on, cells have been dividing and dividing, essentially forever. So life itself doesn't die. Life is what we would call immortal. But the individual dies each generation. So that upper line is the germline, the immortal germline. The lower line are the somatic cells. So there's this barrier in between them. It's called the Weismann barrier, where once the cells become body cells, they can never rejoin that river of life. So it's almost like each generation is like a tributary comes off of the river, but that river freezes solid like ice. It can never go back to water. Even if you think about, for example, if you want to picture this more vividly, think about a muscle cell in your arm. Like, where did that come from? I've indicated it there in red. So that whole circle at the end is a person. Imagine that's you, the muscle cell in your arm. Where did it come from? If you trace back the lineage of that cell, did it come from the muscle in the arm of your parents? No. It came from the germ cells. It came from the ovaries and the testes, the spermatogonial stem cells, the ovarian, the ova of your parents. But those germ cells in them likewise came from the germ cells of your grandparents. And those germ cells came from the germ cells of your great-grandparents. So that muscle cell in your arm became a muscle cell for the very first time in its entire trajectory and life on this earth. So it differentiated into that cell, and it will never go back to being a germ cell. And that's kind of like a death sentence for the cell, effectively. So what we want to do in many ways in aging research is to confer some of the properties of those germ cells onto somatic cells. And there's various ways of doing that. However, why did I say that I believe cellular senescence is what I call the causal nexus, the bridge between the microscopic and the macroscopic? In aging research, there's labs studying all kinds of different damage, telomere shortening, mitochondrial dysfunction, aneuploidy, and so on. And many of these different types of damage lead to cellular senescence. In that Hallmarks of Aging paper that was mentioned earlier, senescence, the loss of proliferation of cells, this kind of block that's imposed on cells, is usually kind of grouped in with all the others. It's kind of, you saw that diagram as a circle, or it's kind of like a Venn diagram of some sort. But I believe that's really not the case. I don't agree with that at all. I think it's wrong, basically. I think that the cellular senescence is a consequence of all of these other things. And then that senescence leads to the macroscopic effects of aging. Loss of proliferation of cells, severe depletion of tissues that you can see amplified in progeria. There's something called the secretory phenotype in non-dividing cells and various other cells, where the cells start secreting damaging molecules to the other cells around them. So senescence is kind of like a target that I think that we should be focusing more on, and that is actually happening. So it's becoming more and more clear that there's something very important, very crucially important about cellular senescence and how this is the nexus of aging that we should be focusing on. Going back to progeria again, like I mentioned all of this damage occurring at an accelerated rate in progeria. There's other diseases like Cockayne syndrome, Werner syndrome, and so on that also resemble progeria to a certain extent. Why do they accelerate aging so dramatically? I believe it's because they're actually these mutations occur even earlier up the causal chain. So I refer to them as supercausative. So for example, in the progeria mutation, that mutation itself actually accelerates telomere erosion, it accelerates epigenetic changes, it leads to mitochondrial damage, and then in turn, those microscopic damages lead to cellular senescence, the intermediate factor, the causal nexus, and then that leads to aging. So I think we need to understand aging, we need to really create a very well thought out causal chain. We can't just put everything together and say, these are the hallmarks of aging, and let's think about all of them. I think there's a very important sequential step in all of these. And actually a human, the factors in humans that may accelerate aging, like telomere erosion, may not necessarily be occurring at the same rate in mice, for example. So there may be differences in species by the actual types of damage that are leading to cellular senescence, but in both species, cellular senescence is crucially important to the consequence, the final consequence, the macroscopic effects of aging. And we can reverse aging through reprogramming. We need to scale up. We need to go not just from reversing aging at the cellular senescence level, we need to increase that to decreasing inflammation, endocrine dysfunction. When we reprogram, we kind of go from a macroscopic level down to a microscopic, down to the cellular level, but we don't really come back up yet. So we can reprogram cells in the lab. We've done this with progeria cells. We can reprogram them back to an embryonic state. But we haven't yet got to the point where we can create organs or organoids or tissues. So we're kind of going down the scale, but we're not really coming up. And I think that needs to be the focus going forward. If you bear with me just a few last slides from a philosophical point of view. Some of us are kind of interested in various aspects of philosophy. I know Keith, I actually saw one of his seminars was about the simulation hypothesis. What might this have to do with aging? And can we kind of put this in a context of what life might be all about? So some of you may be aware that there's an idea going around that the reality that we perceive around us is actually a simulation. That the Earth, the universe, is in fact some kind of artificial virtual reality that's a consequence of something that's taking place on a deeper level. The Matrix and so on, it's sometimes proposed that we are kind of programs running on a computer. I don't actually believe that at all. So I don't think that we are running on, that our lives are running on a computer simulation. But I think that reality itself may be a deeper projection from a deeper level of reality. So for the universe itself may be a projection from a singularity. And in many ways, that's what mainstream physics is saying, that the features of space and time actually came from a singularity, something that was uncreated, eternal, exists outside of space and time, and then projected itself through light, through electromagnetic radiation, into this domain of space and time. So in many ways, this reality is a projection from the arc, from the foundation, from the singularity into dimensionality. And it seems to be evolving towards something. This reality is increasing in complexity, in diversity, in intelligence, and many of the qualities that we would normally associate with the divine. Reality is projecting towards those qualities. So it starts out very simple and then increases towards greater and greater intelligence, complexity, love, or all of these qualities that we would normally associate with divinity. So if you consider reality within that context, what are we as human beings meant to do here? You know, you can also think of it, if we really are a simulation, why would we be here? If it's a simulation, maybe it's a training ground for consciousness. What do we really need to learn? Aristotle used this term entelechy, which is a conversion of potential into actuality. So you could think of a human being as an organism that we need to convert our potential into actuality. We need to develop ourselves and manifest our greatest potential, and then join that, our own individual entelechy, into the entelechy of the universe, actually transfer over our self-actualization into the actualization of the cosmos. So this is a lot of material to get through in such a short time, so forgive me for kind of cramming this all into one thing. But I think that aging itself should actually, because of these reasons that I've just outlined, aging should be considered within the context of the other issues that are facing humanity. We can't just crash ahead and say, you know, we're going to solve aging. I think we should, but we can't do it without putting it in a broader context. The time that we're living in is kind of a liminal moment. It's a transition point for humanity. There's many, many things happening for the first time in this very, very narrow window of time that have never happened before. Life extension, aging research, search for like extraterrestrial intelligence. We will know within 1 or 2 decades whether we are alone in the universe or there are other civilizations out there. Artificial intelligence is coming along for the first time. Exploration of the solar system. We are reaching a crisis point with economic systems. We need to allow everyone to develop this maximum entelechy, this maximum potential. So we're kind of it's crunch time. We know we need to get our act together. Otherwise, you know, things could become very dangerous. You know, we're almost at a diversion point. With regard to aging itself, it's almost unique within the context of all these other problems that we face, in that only 1 or 2 generations will ever have the choice to fight for immortality or life extension or extreme longevity. So in the past, Keith had a picture of Gilgamesh up there, and we know that for eons humanity has dreamed about acquiring immortality, about dramatically extending life. In the future, 100, 200 years from now, this problem will be solved. I mean, if you project the technology the way it's going, I have no doubt that we will understand and control aging within a century. So there will only ever be 1 or 2 generations of humans that, whether you regard this as a simulation or not, that will ever have the choice to fight for it. Can we get across the line? Can we do it within our lifetimes, or will we fail? Historically, this quest has been associated with various religions, in particular alchemy. So alchemy was a sort of proto-scientific tradition in philosophy concerned with the idea of the transmutation of various objects. For example, the transmutation of base metals, lead, into gold, the creation of an elixir of immortality, the creation of a panacea to cure any disease, perfection of the human body and soul from the alchemical magnum opus, so this great work, this enlightenment. What I'm getting at is that historically, all of these problems that I've just been talking about were grouped together, so they were considered as a whole. Chief among them was this idea of the philosopher's stone. Can we unify all of these problems? Or what can we use to solve these problems? The so-called object that the alchemists were searching for was the philosopher's stone. I propose that the philosopher's stone is not actually an object at all. It's kind of a riddle. The philosopher's stone is actually mind. It's actually enlightened intelligence. So the last thing you think of when you think of a stone is mind. They seem to be opposite. In order to solve these problems, some of which we've already done, transmutation of metals through nuclear reactions, we've done already. But in order to solve all these problems, we actually need to raise our intelligence, raise our level of mind up to a higher level, and start to integrate knowledge. Going back to the simulation hypothesis, if you were incarnating, so to speak, into a reality that was a simulation, and you wanted to give yourself a challenge, what would you do? If you think of this simulation as a game, what is a good game? What is the best kind of game? It's not one that you can just win easily. It's not noughts and crosses. It shouldn't be too easy, but it shouldn't be too hard. It shouldn't be impossible. In order to complete it, you'd have to develop your maximum, your intellect would have to be developed to the absolute maximum in order to win that game. You might even have to change the world to an extent that you'd have to marshal the resources of the planet in order to accomplish it. If you were selfish, if you were too focused on your own goals and so on, you would actually fail. So you would actually have to participate in a kind of change in consciousness that would also lead to a change in global consciousness. And maybe that's our summons. This is a painting by a Russian painter, Vasnetsov. It's called The Night at the Crossroads. There's various anecdotes in Russia about nights at crossroads. If you go one way, you lose your head. If you go another, you lose your horse, and so on. I don't think we have to lose. I think we can win, but we have to elevate our intelligence to even higher levels to solve these problems. Thank you.